Liberty, therefore, for Rousseau is not something which can be adjusted or compromised. You aren't allowed to give away a little bit of it, or much of it. You aren't allowed to barter so much freedom for so much security, so much freedom for so much happiness. That is exactly like dying a little, dehumanizing yourself a little. And the thing which is very passionately held by Rousseau, one of the values upon which he really spent more eloquence than almost upon any other, is this notion of human integrity. The fact that the ultimate crime, the one sin not to be born, is dehumanization of man, degradation of man, exploitation of man. He spends a great deal of his passionate rhetoric on denouncing those who use other people for their own selfish purposes. Not because they make the people whom they use unhappy, as because in some way they dehumanize them. In some way they make them lose their human semblance. And that is, for him, the sin against the Holy Ghost. In short, freedom for Rousseau is an absolute value. And to say of a value that it is absolute is to say that one can't compromise it at all. Now, so far so good. We now have an attitude towards man which makes of liberty the most sacred of his attributes. Indeed, not an attribute at all, but the essence of what being a man is. But there are other values too. It is impossible simply to declare that freedom, individual freedom, the permission to men to do what they like, a situation in which anybody does anything, is the ideal condition of man, and that for two reasons. First of all, there is the empirical reason. For one reason or another, for one cause or another, men live in societies. Why this happens, Rousseau never quite clearly explains. Possibly because of the inequality of gifts, which made some men stronger than others and enabled them to assert their power over others and so enslave them. Perhaps because of some inevitable law of evolution, perhaps because of a natural instinct of sociableness which drives people to live together. Perhaps for the reasons which the encyclopedia stated, division of labor for the purpose of leading a life which satisfies more of men's wishes than the isolated life of savages would satisfy. Sometimes Rousseau talks about the savage as if he was happy, innocent, and good. At other times, as if he was merely simple and barbarous. But be that as it may, men do live in society. And since they live in society, they have to create rules whereby human beings must so conduct themselves as not to get in each other's way too much, not frustrate each other, not employ their power in such a way as to abort too many of each other's purposes and ends. And therefore there is simply the empirical problem: how is a human being to remain absolutely free, for if he's not free, he's not human, and yet not do everything that he wants. For what is freedom if it isn't doing what I want and not being stopped from doing it? There is also a further and a deeper reason for Rousseau. He was, after all, a citizen of Geneva and deeply affected by its Calvinist tradition. And therefore, for Rousseau, there is an ever-present vision of the rules of life. He is deeply concerned about right and wrong, about justice and injustice. There are certain ways of living which are right and certain ways of living which are wrong. In common with the rest of the 18th century, he believes that the question, how should I live, is a real question and has a real answer like any other factual question. And therefore, however we may come by it, by reason or by some other route, there is some answer to the question, how ought I to live? Now, given that I have obtained this answer, or think I have obtained it, then there is a rule of life, which says, do thus, do not do thus. This is wrong, this is right. This is just, this is unjust. This is good, this is bad. This is handsome, this is ugly. But once we have rules, once we have laws, once we have some kind of regulations which prescribe human life, what is to happen to liberty? How can liberty be compatible with regulations which, after all, hem man in, prevent him from doing anything he wants, tell him what to do and what not to do, forbid him to do certain things, control him to a certain degree? And Rousseau is very passionate about this. He says that these laws, these rules of life, are not conventions. They are not utilitarian devices invented by man simply for the purpose of achieving some short-term end. No, not at all. Let me quote from him again. They are graven not on tablets of marble or brass, but on the heart of the citizens. And again, the laws of nature, the sacred imprescriptible law, which speaks to the heart of man and to his reason. And again, he says, the power of willing or of choosing, which is, of course, choosing the right path in this case, is not explicable by any mechanical laws. It is something inherent in man, and the laws which he obeys are something which is absolute, from which he must not depart. In this respect, Rousseau is, as it were, a secular version of Calvinism. The one thing which he perpetually insists upon is that laws are not conventions, are not conveniences, but simply the drawing up in terms suitable to the time and the place and the people of regulations embodying sacred truths, sacred rules, which are not man-made, but absolute. And so we have a paradox. We have two absolute values, the absolute value of freedom and the absolute value of rules. And we are not allowed to compromise between them. We're not allowed to do what Hobbes said might be done, namely, so much freedom, so much authority, so much control, so much individual initiative. Neither of these values may be derogated from. To derogate from freedom is to kill man's immortal soul. To derogate from the rules is to do something absolutely wrong, absolutely bad, absolutely wicked, to fly against the source of the rules, which is sometimes called nature, sometimes conscience, sometimes God, which in any case is absolute. And this is the dreadful dilemma in which he's plunged, and it's different from the dilemma of those previous thinkers who thought that in some sense adjustment, compromise, empirical devices can produce a solution which is neither wholly good nor wholly bad, but adequate, something enabling human beings to carry on in a moderately convenient fashion, simply based upon common sense and respect, moderate respect, decent respect, due respect, for most of each other's desires, so that people on the whole get not everything they want, but more than they would get under some other system. That, for Rousseau, is unacceptable. An absolute value means that you cannot compromise, you cannot modify. And he puts this in a very dramatical fashion. He says that the problem for him is to find a form of association in which each, while uniting himself with all, yet may still only obey himself alone and remain as free as before. Well, this puts the paradox in a paradoxical form. How can we, at one and the same time, unite ourselves with other people and therefore found a form of association which in some way must exercise some degree of authority, which is quite different from being entirely alone in nature, and yet not obey them? And of course, his celebrated answer, which is known the world over, given by in the work called The Social Contract, is that each man, in giving himself to all, gives himself to nobody. And that's a very dark and mysterious observation. Rousseau was a thinker who loved paradox, but his strangeness as a thinker goes deeper than that. He obviously was tormented by this terrible dilemma, on neither horn of which he wished to impale himself, and then he describes in the letter the fact that suddenly he obtained a blinding solution to it. On the way, on one of his walks along a lake in Switzerland, the solution suddenly came upon him with a blinding flash of inspiration. He felt like a mathematician who had suddenly solved a long and torturing problem, like an artist to whom the vision was suddenly vouchsafed, like a mystic who suddenly saw the truth, the transcendental truth. He tells us how he sat down at the roadside and wept and was beside himself, and how this was the central event of his entire life. And the tone in which he communicates his solution, both in The Social Contract and his other works, is exactly that of a man possessed by an idea, of a maniac, who suddenly sees a cosmic solution vouchsafed to him alone. Somebody who for the first time in history has suddenly found the answer to a problem which had tormented the whole of humanity, which previous great thinkers, perhaps Plato, perhaps Christ, had in some way enunciated, but which he and he alone had at last found in full, rich form, so that nobody need trouble to look for the solution again. He is like a geometer who has found a solution which is not merely true but demonstrable, which is not merely true but proven by rules of such iron logic that nobody can ever refute it again. What is this solution? Well, he proceeds like a mathematician with two lines which intersect each other. He says to himself, here is liberty and here is authority, and it is difficult, it is impossible to arrange a compromise. How then are we to reconcile them? And the answer has a kind of simplicity and a kind of lunacy, which maniacal natures are often capable of. He says it isn't a question of compromise. There is a way of looking at this problem which makes it clear that they coincide, that it is possible to obtain a kind of liberty which is identical with authority. It is possible to obtain a kind of personal freedom which is the same as complete control by authority. The more free, the more authoritative. The more liberty, the more control. How is this to be achieved? The solution, Rousseau's solution, is that after all, freedom simply consists in men wanting certain things and not being prevented from having them. Well, now, what is wanting? What I always want is that which is good for me. And of course, if I don't know what is good for me, then when I get what I want, I suffer because it turns out not what I really wanted at all. Therefore, only those are free who don't merely want certain things, but who also know what in fact will satisfy them. Now, if a man knows what will satisfy him, then he's endowed with reason, and reason gives him the answer to the question, what should I seek for that my nature may be fully satisfied? What is true of one rational man will be true of other rational men. Just as, I suppose, in the case of the sciences, what one scientist finds to be true will be true for other scientists as well, so that if you have reached your conclusion by a proper method, from true premises, by correct rules, you may be certain that other people, if they are rational, will arrive at the same solution, or alternatively, if they arrive at some different solution, they cannot be rational. So Rousseau knows that if nature is a harmony, and this is the great premise, the great and dubious premise of the whole of 18th century thought, that if nature is a harmony, then what I truly want cannot collide with what somebody else truly wants. For if it were the case that what I want does not square with what somebody else truly wants, then two true answers to two genuine questions will be incompatible with each other. And that is impossible. That means that nature is not a harmony, that tragedy is inevitable, that conflict cannot be avoided, that somewhere at the heart of things there is something irrational, that do what I may, be I never so wise, whatever weapons of reason I employ, however good a man I am, however upright a man I am, and however clear-headed and reasonable and profound and wise a man I am, I may yet want something which an equally wise, equally good, equally virtuous man may wish the opposite of. And therefore, tragedy is not, after all, due to human error, human stupidity, and human mistakes. And that neither Rousseau nor any other 18th century thinker can really accept. Consequently, if nature is a harmony, anything that satisfies one rational man must be of such a nature as at any rate to be compatible with whatever satisfies other rational men.